Welcome to the Money to the Masses podcast, putting you in control of your finances. It's a good thing podcasts are free, as this one isn't worth a penny. Here are your hosts, Damien Fay and Andy Leakes.
Now, Damien, before we get on with this week's podcast, you had something quickly to say about our sponsors.
Yeah, we've got a new sponsor, Money Farm, and Money Farm are an online investment advisor and one of the biggest digital wealth management companies in Europe. So a big thank you to them for sponsoring the podcast. Now, Money Farm create portfolios to maximise long-term returns using ETFs to make incredibly cheap portfolios. And you even get the first £10,000 of your portfolio invested without any charge from Money Farm. And if you enter the code MTTM20K into the box when you sign up, you get the first £20,000 of your portfolio invested and run by moneyfarm.com without any charge.
Great stuff. On with this week's show. Hello and welcome to episode 109 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leakes. Damien, how are you doing? Welcome back.
Good to be back, Andy. Sorry, that's a bit unprofessional to start the show laughing, but Andy was away last week. And it took
yeah, I'm a bit rusty.
It took Andy 2 takes to get the opening of the show. He'd forgotten how he started it, even though we are on episode 109. I'm good, Andy, anyway, in answer to your question. And I'm even more happy about you being back, because there's a very lonely place doing a podcast on your own and talking for 20 minutes endlessly.
I have to say you did really well, because people do it all the time, talk on their own. It's not something new for someone to stand up and actually talk to people, but they've normally got an audience who they're sort of getting some sort of feedback from, even if it's in the form of eye contact or a raised eyebrow or a sort of nod in agreement. You're staring at a blank screen when you do it. And I know we've got good friends in the podcast industry, people like Pete Matthew, who often do podcasts on their own. But you being a relative newbie to it, I have to say, duck to water, I am scared. I'm worried I'm going to be sacked.
I'm not going to become a solo act just yet, Andy, so you've got nothing to worry about. But I just had to visualise you at the other end, Andy. I almost got a cutout and put you there so I could talk at you. But no, I think I pulled it off last week. But it's better. It's better when we're together, I think. So 2 heads are better than 1.
We're better when we're together. Good. Okay, so I suppose we've got a couple of weeks' worth of personal catching up time. Have you been up to much in the last week?
I mentioned last week's podcast I was away on looking at the future of the internet, which you obviously know, Andy, because you edit the thing. Even though Andy was sick last week, Andy still edits the podcast, so you heard that part. But this week, no, I've just had the usual fun that any parent of young children have, where you sort of have trying to sort them out, sleeping, not sleeping, trips to A&E, well, you know, the usual stuff, Andy. So yeah, nothing too eventful, just a normal life of a parent of 2 young children, really. What about you? What have you been up to?
Not much at all, apart from
recovery.
And once I felt a lot... I tell you what I did do. I went to the cinema for the first time on my own.
Really?
Yeah, I've never done it before. I'm not very good with my own company. I certainly wouldn't be able to do a podcast on my own.
You went to the cinema on your own?
Yeah, I don't know what possessed me, really. I wasn't feeling great, and then I started to feel better. And on the day that I started to feel better and kind of felt like I needed my own space, my house was inundated with kind of like a child's sleepover type thing. And so there was loads of people around the house, and I just felt like I needed a bit of space. So it was raining. There wasn't much that I could do apart from decided to go and see a film.
Do you know what? When you first said that, I just thought, what a weirdo. And I know there are people out there who do go to the cinema on their own, Andy, so now you've explained it, I totally get it. And if you're really into films, I could see that I'd end up going to the cinema on my own, especially if you've got kids, because your partner can't come. But what did you see? What did you watch, Andy?
I saw a film called Arrival, or The Arrival. I think it's Arrival. It's about alien... Anyone who knows me knows that I'm totally not into the sort of the geeky, supernatural sort of science stuff. I mean, I don't mind the thrillers, but I'm more into sort of... My viewing is generally documentaries, that kind of stuff, Attenborough, real life stuff. So it's really unlike me, one, to really choose to go and watch fiction at the best of times, but even more so to go sort of wacky, sciencey down that route. So it just literally the only reason I went to see it was because the time sort of fitted with the time that I got there. It was a case of looking up the board and just going 3:40.
And it was the only film that had a high enough age classification, so when you went in, parents weren't shuffling their children away from you as you sat down on the end.
Do you know what? I still thundered through a large popcorn and a large drink and a whole grab bag full of chocolate.
High five, Andy. Whenever I go to the cinema, I tend to come out with a headache because I've done too much of that. Good. Well, let's tell you what, I need to go to the cinema. It's just so expensive. But anyway, I'm not going to moan about it. So, what's on the podcast this week? Well, I had to, I'm again cramming in. I've dropped one or two things, but we've got a piece on, an important piece actually, about child benefit and pensions it's come up in the news, but surprisingly so. But I'm going to talk about it and explain it as it's topical. There was something about finances and young people, and I've before on the podcast have given my 2 pence worth about financial education quite a long time ago now, but it's worth me revisiting some of that because there's been a lot of talk about certain people in the press who like to pat themselves on the back, and I just want to talk about that. And I've got something on investing to do with markets, very light, and something that's a bit philosophical that people will like. And the final thing, I had an epic question from somebody who listens to this podcast, and I am going to go through the whole thing. It's kind of like a not quite a financial plan, but it's a person who is trying to buy a house but is fairly young, just a typical person a couple who are trying to get their finances in order ahead of wanting to get a house together. So they're really asking what I would do in this situation. So I'm going to tell you.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, it sounds like we've got quite a lot to cover. What should we start with?
Look, I'll go with like you say, we've got to whistle through quite a bit of this. So I'm going to go with the child benefit story. This is about pensions, right? And the story is that for people who are, do you know that when we have children and you can get child benefit and you can claim it? Now, there's a rule if you earn over £50,000 a year. We've talked about it a long, long time ago. I think really early on in the podcast when it was first introduced, whereby if you're a couple and you one of you earns over £50,000, then there's a tapering of your child benefit amount you can claim up until £60,000. So if, let's just say husband and wife, I'm not being stereotypical or sexist, let's just say the man is earning £50,000, then they get their full child benefit that everyone's entitled to claim. As soon as he starts earning above 50, it starts to get tapered down, and by the time he earns £60,000, he doesn't get any child benefit. Now, under the rules, what you can do is you can keep getting the child benefit, but then you have to pay it back at the end of the tax year via a self-assessment. And for a lot of people, that's a real pain because they aren't self-employed or don't file a tax return because they might earn money under PAYE. And particularly because it's always sensible for again, I'm not being sexist, but I think it's sensible for the wife or the mother to claim the child benefit because, I mean, my wife and I do that. We do it that way round. And the only reason I think it's quite sensible is because if anything were to happen, then there's a tiny amount of money that's going to them. Otherwise, it's just another thing you have to unravel. I'm not being pessimistic, but it's just because the mother tends to be the carer in a lot of cases anyway when people separate. But that's by the by. But the point is that if you're a couple, that's what's unfair really about these rules. I don't like using the word unfair because life's unfair and it sounds a bit spoiled and brattish when people go, oh, that's not fair. But a couple could earn £49,000, £999 each, and so almost have £100,000 in total income and not have any reduction in their child benefit. Well, that's just the way life is and the rules were made. So if one of you starts earning above £50,000, it gets tapered. Now, you had the choice, rather than filling tax returns, you could just say to the powers that be, hey, I don't want to get this child benefit, right? I just don't want it because I'm not going to get it and then pay you back in a year and have to fill in a tax return. I just don't want it. Now, when the rules first came about, there was a slight issue because people were doing that, quite rightly, they didn't want to, but there was a lot of discrepancy over whether you would get credit for your state pension, because when a woman, say a parent, doesn't work because they may stay at home and look after their children, then if the child is under 12, they get a credit for their national insurance record. Because do you remember your state pension is based on your years of national insurance contributions, and you have to have a certain amount, and if you get the full amount, you can then get a full state pension. The problem is that, quite rightly, if somebody stayed at home, then they may not realise, but they might stay at home and not pay national insurance because they're not earning a wage, but unfortunately they wouldn't get any credit towards their state pension. So when they got to retirement, what would happen is they would suddenly not have a full state pension and be surprised, and it's almost too late to do too much about it. And there was when these child benefit rules came in, there was a bit of confusion over whether people who rejected the money and said, I don't want it, would actually be given credit for the national insurance contributions for those years while the child was under 12 and count towards their state pension. And it turned out in the end that they did. But there's been a kind of it's always been there, but there's been a slight issue. I don't know, it's not loophole because they're things you exploit, but a bit of a gap that people are falling down, whereby somebody's coming, admittedly people who are earning quite decent money, so say somebody's earning over £50,000, they haven't had children, they decide to have a child, and therefore when it gets to the point where you go and claim child benefit, they go, do you know what, I'm not entitled into it anyway. So particularly if someone earns over 60,000, then they wouldn't be able to get child benefit anyway, and they'll sit there and go, well, there's no point us claiming it because we're not entitled to it, so we won't claim. The problem is that those people weren't being registered as having children in effect, and therefore weren't. Do you see where I'm coming from? So they weren't actually getting into the system to say that, oh, this lady needs to be getting national insurance contribution
credits.
That's the word, Andy. This lady should be getting national insurance credits for the years she's looking after her children. So what happens? What you should be doing is you should claim for child benefit, but on the form now there is a tick box that says you don't want to claim the money, but you want to be credited for the national insurance contributions. So this point of the podcast is to say, make sure if you are fortunate enough to earn over £60,000 a year, or one of you does in a couple, and I know that sounds a lot of money, but if you think £60,000 between two people, that's about 30, or do you know what I mean, an average between the two, so that's not a lot above national average earnings in some way, especially in the south. Make sure you do claim the child benefit, but tick the box to say you don't want it, and that way you'll get a full state pension or your full credit towards it. And it is an issue because there's apparently 37,500 people who in 2015, 2016 didn't claim, and it's gone right, and it didn't claim child benefit, and they fell through this gap, and they reckon that there's about 20,000 people a year who are falling through this gap. So it's getting bigger and bigger, and it's rolling into millions and billions of pounds. And typically, just to show people why it's worth doing, if you don't claim for 2 years of national insurance contributions, so you don't have that credit, then you will probably lose out on about £200 a year in your state pension when you get there. That doesn't sound a lot, but £200, don't forget your state pension is paid until you die. And if you can claim it from when you're in your 60s until you may live to 90, then that soon starts to rack up, and it's just about filling in a form. So make sure you do it, is the point of this piece.
Good, what's next?
I'm going to quickly touch upon the teenagers being ill-prepared over finances. Now, the Money Advice Service, you know, people who listen to this podcast will know I'm not the biggest fan of the Money Advice Service. I just think it was badly run. I think the people work there are lovely, but the whole concept didn't really, they're wasting lots of money. £60 million a year their budget was, and they didn't achieve what they were set out to achieve. Now, they did do a bit of research in the last couple of weeks that showed that people that are aged between 16 and 17 admit that they are ill prepared for finances going into adulthood. And
they needed to do a full-on bit of research to come up to that conclusion.
Well,
I could have told you that.
Yeah, do you know what, Andy? People, if you could see, Andy can see me obviously, but if you could see me while I'm recording this podcast, my head is in my hands because I don't want to sound like I told you so, but it is an element of I told you so, because people who may have heard me on the podcast before and written, this is what happens with young people. That, of course, they don't know about money because they're in the world where parents these days don't show them or they don't teach them about money because they don't see money being used. When was the last time you saw you use hard cash or your children pay with cash? Lots of people don't because they pay with card, and especially now you've got contactless cards. So they don't get the concept of what money is and how much things are worth, and that's just an unfortunate consequence of the way the digital world is going. Of course, this research showed that they're ill prepared for the world outside. And of course, there are lots of people who are saying that's why we need financial education on the curriculum, and slapping backs and saying, well done on getting your MBE for getting it on the curriculum. And that's all wonderful, and I do agree with that, and I do totally get that we should be teaching children about finances. But the point, the research obviously has shown the gaping hole, and it has identified a need. But there was something in there that did highlight a point that I've been making for a while, which is that it's not just about financial education, where the research seems to say that's what the solution is. They hinted that parents should be doing something. And the problem with financial education is that, what do you teach kids? I mean, if you ask anybody to explain what APR is, even though they deal with it regularly, they see these products. Even I talk about money all the time, and occasionally I have to refresh myself about certain key things. So what chance is somebody who is a child or teenager going to have when they eventually buy their first house? Don't forget, the age at which people are buying their first house is now about a decade later than it probably was the previous generation. So the education and the point that people are making financial decisions are getting further and further away. And I can't remember anything from school, really. Can you, Andy? Can you remember half the figures and statistics that you were taught? I mean, we all sat there and went to our teachers, is this going to help me in life?
No, absolutely. I struggle on to recall some of the simple maths, even though I consider myself quite good at maths. Just things like trigonometry, pi, things like that. They're just words to me now. They have no real meaning, and it's scary how quickly you forget. Even basic algebra, which I found relatively easy at school, looking at it now on paper, I kind of forgotten.
Yeah, that's the point. I think that the education, or the help that people needs to be done at the point at which they make a financial decision. And that is very difficult. In this world of being connected, that's becoming more and more possible, but it's still a long way off. It's hard to do. And this research actually pointed out that a lot of these people had that their parents didn't save regularly. So half of the parents who were also asked said they did not save regularly, and they said that they didn't feel confident about managing their money. So it did identify the need to speak to parents as well to help the children. And it's something that we talked about previously, and I'm a real believer in. I don't think it should stop at parents. I think it should go to the elderly in society, because after all, we are humans. And if you watch any David Attenborough program, there's a great one on telly at the moment, and you see how all animals, they evolve and they learn from their parents. We humans do the same thing, and we all do it when it comes to in the real world, when something we don't understand, we tend to turn. Okay, we might go to the internet, but we probably also turn to our peers and our parents and our grandparents and ask what they think, especially about money. Because you think they've been there and they've done it, especially with money, I think. And so therefore, who are the people who are going to inform them about the decisions? It's not going to be their teachers, because they don't respect their teachers anyway. And that's a bit of a sweeping statement, but let's be honest, we all still laugh about some of our teachers when we were younger. And so I think the real financial education is important. I think we should just teach kids maths a bit better. I think that should be more of a priority, because if you have a better numeracy, I think you're going to have a much better grasp of anything to do with money. And also, we need to use money more than just all the contactless stuff, but more importantly, teach adults. And that means not just parents, but grandparents, because then that will stop them being victims of scams. But when kids go and ask them, Dad, should I get a repayment mortgage? Or Dad, what do you reckon about this? Or they reach out for help, they will tend to go to their family. Not always, but then they can pass that knowledge on. Anyway, I've stopped ranting, Andy.
I think it's a really important point, and I think it's an important point for parents and grandparents to make sure that their knowledge is up to date, because I think what often happens is a lot of parents will just think back to what they did when they were young, and obviously times move. I mean, if parents didn't keep with the times, you'd be advising people to take out endowment mortgages and whole of life insurance policies, which, as we know now, they're not the sort of product of nowadays. They've long since been superseded by better products. So
yeah, but they've also been, like you're saying, and you are absolutely spot on in my opinion, Andy, because they got badly burnt by them. So it's a bit of that once bitten, twice shy. But the other thing, that's why you get these investment beliefs that come in that are based on for example, the property one. We're all obsessed with property in this country. We want to buy, got to buy houses, bricks and mortar. You can't go wrong, and that's because the generations before may have done that, but the world is slightly different now, and I think that they've been told that and it's been passed down. But actually, what they're telling you is, yeah, lock all your money into an asset that is illiquid. You can't get out very quickly, and put all your eggs in one basket. Now, if you take the advice like that, that seems not the best advice in the world. But because it's passed down, and it's what their dads told them, and the previous generations, it comes down. It seems to be it's ingrained, and of course we need to start trying to undo all that and try and teach them something that's a bit more well-rounded. And like I said, it helps with preventing scams. So financial education in schools is great, but call me a cynic, and I apologise if I seem cynical about it. Jamie Oliver, went into schools, and he went to campaign to do school dinners. Now, let's draw a parallel. If you work in money, what's the parallel that's going to get you an MBE? Yeah, you go and get money being spoken about in schools, and that's how you get your MBEs and things like that. And I'm not pointing fingers, and I think people can pretty much guess the sort of people I'm talking about. But I think that they're well-meaning, but I do think some of the things are campaigns, and I think we need to do a broader. Why do we always cast old people on the heap as if to say they're almost redundant and don't know what they're doing? And why is it the schools have to teach everything? Because I think the schools have got a hard enough time teaching people about the basics of maths and all those other curriculum things, then trying to cram on something about money. Of course, skip some money stuff on there, but let's not obsess about the real detail. Anyway, I'm ranting. Let's move on.
Good stuff. Okay, so moving on. We've got, you mentioned earlier markets and something philosophical. I love a bit of philosophy. So, Damien, what are we talking about?
Well, I suppose I use the wrong word, really. It's not philosophical. It's a bit of teaching people the way that markets work, not in a technical sense, but so they realise the reasons why occasionally I tell people not to read the papers and obsess about the investment news and stuff like that, which obviously seems counterintuitive for somebody who's trying to teach the world about money, is to say basically don't ignore a lot of it. And Donald Trump, I'm not dating the podcast, but Donald Trump this week when he became, or last week when he became the next president of the USA, is that he provided a brilliant, almost an example of how markets tell stories. Right? This is the point of this piece I'm about to tell you. It's about markets tell stories. They're looking for stories. They invest based on stories, and it's very rarely on fact. So what will happen is, given any scenario, the market will start to have a story of some kind that they will use to explain or rationalise what's going on, which is very hard to do because the world isn't rational. So something will happen and they'll go, oh yes, that happened because central banks were going to, if they start increasing rates, well, that starts removing liquidity from the system, and that will mean that the economy, it may they start making a story which ultimately means that money won't flood into risky assets, the shares will go down, and of course that oversimplifies the world, and the world isn't really like that. So to give probably a comparison, you know when you have children and they're in bed at night and they sit there and they talk to you and they're trying to waste time and not go to sleep, and they start asking,
I know exactly that situation.
That situation when they start asking you something, and they ask you, it's when they throw you a real curveball, a really difficult question, and so therefore you end up either saying just go to sleep, or you end up creating some story because it may be trying to shelter them from the truth or whatever it is. Do you know what I mean? They might ask you about monsters or I don't know, whatever it will be, or why did someone at school do this to them? And of course what you do is you then sometimes will make a bit of a story to try and explain the world to them and maybe protect them from things. But mainly what you do is you'll make a story of why no one's going to climb through their window at night and stuff like that. And you actually tell a story that police do something. And investment markets are very similar. They work on that very juvenile principle that they will have a story which they think, which simplifies the world, makes them feel better, and then they go mental with it, and then they just invest. And with Donald Trump, what happened is the world has believed that we don't know what's going on. They all went crazy. The markets didn't do what people thought the markets would do. Donald Trump being elected was a complete off the wall. It was something that wasn't really expected by most people. So the markets didn't know what to do. So they didn't have a story. They've been telling themselves all sorts of stories about what was going to happen when Clinton got elected, or whether central banks were doing XYZ or printing money. And they had a nice story. And even sometimes they use analogies from children's stories. They end up using, you'll hear commentators talk about the Goldilocks syndrome there, where that was where central banks were. If they printed money, it made shares go up because they were supporting the market. But if they started stopping printing money and raising interest rates, then that actually is a sign the economy is coming off life support and is good. But they actually were worried that it would mean shares they weren't having that sort of stuff pumped in, and actually they would rather it not be too good news or too bad news. They wanted something in the middle. So the Goldilocks, it's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's somewhere in the middle. They didn't want really good news that the economy was recovering, because then all this easy money would disappear. And so they would use the Goldilocks sort of analogy, and they would tell a story and everyone would bet on it. So Donald Trump is a brilliant example. No one knows what's going to happen with Donald Trump. You listen to this in the future, you will know what's happened with Donald Trump, even if he's still here or whatever. And they decided that they would make up a story that Donald Trump's going to spend loads of money on infrastructure, because he kept saying he's going to build a wall, he's going to do all these crazy things. So they worked out, right, do you know what, that means that these shares are going to be really good, or bonds are going to go down. And suddenly the world went mental with that story, and markets lurched and have started to all back one thing. The dollar's gone flying. So the point is not about the here and now, and about what is happening in the market currently. What I wanted to highlight to people is that even in a scenario where there is no story or no consensus, the market will eventually find a story that's not there, because Donald Trump doesn't know what he's thinking 1 minute to the next. How can you predict what's going to happen in the market? I spoke about this last week. So they find a story, they all kind of agree they like this story, it makes them all feel good, and so therefore they've gone with it. And to anyone listening to this podcast, look for the story. Look for the story that's being made up to oversimplify things. And then what tends to happen is they run with the story, and then when they realise that it's a fairy tale, it all goes wrong, and then the bets all unwind. And at the moment, the markets have done that. They've gone a very long way in one direction based on this story. That's not, when you look at it, it's just made up. There's no real evidence for any of it. So look for the story in every investment situation, and the best place often to look for those is in the financial press. And they are like comics sometimes, and they print these stories and they inflate them, and look for those. And that's why sometimes I say to people, don't read it. So it's all a fairy tale.
Yeah, I hope it is a fairy tale, because all fairy tales end, as you know, with "and they all lived happily ever after." So let's hope that that's what's going to happen with the markets. What have we got next? Oh, we've got this lengthy listener question about moving house and what the best thing to do is. That
yeah,
right?
I had a brilliant email from I won't say their name because they gave me quite a bit of detail. I'm going to quickly run through it. I'll read this out, and I might jump through parts of it. I recently started listening to your podcast and wanted to write you an email, as I know you mentioned in the previous podcast like you like to hear reviews, etc., etc. Until very recently, I think I was like every other 28-year-old I knew in terms of my relationships with money and savings, living from paycheck to paycheck. I started listening to your podcast. It's so wonderful. Well, I actually added that bit, but I guess I paraphrased. I guess my question is, what do you advise me to do? I'm 29. I live in the city renting. My boyfriend and I pay £900 a month into a joint account to cover rent, bills, etc. I make 35 grand a year plus 2 bonuses. I have a credit card of £500, which doesn't have a balance on it. I don't use it. I'm always in my overdraft of £1,700 and struggling to get out, although I hope to be out of it by February. I get charged around £25 a month to be in my overdraft. That's a lot. Is it better to swap to zero charge account, or as I've been with my bank, this is quite a good point, as I've been with my bank since I was 8, should I stay with them, as I would have it would be good for my credit history. I recently set up a private pension, blah blah blah, and they pay a certain amount in, and they're keen to put in as much as possible. I really wasn't sure which pension was best. I also have a pension I contribute through with work and set to the maximum allowances. She also has a student loan which she clears, but the problem is she has a terrible credit score because she moved house, didn't realise she had a telephone bill that was unpaid, and it went all a bit wrong because obviously it wasn't paid and it damaged her credit rating. And she's never had any other issues, defaults or anything on payments. And she also puts money into a Help to Buy ISA, which is currently worth around £1,400. They pay £200 a month, and any bonuses she's going to receive going forward, she's going to put towards a deposit for a flat. So she's asking what should she do, because she's obviously trying to buy a house going forward. Now,
it sounds like, I have to say, just my two penneth worth for 28, 29. This isn't to be condescending or whatever. I'm just almost 10 years beyond her age. She's doing very well, I have to say. She's got the basics, and she's thinking forward. So I think well done her already.
If you could play a round of applause, then we should, because my view is she's actually being a bit of a legend with what she's doing so far. And of course, like all financial plans and people giving their two penneth worth, there are different views. But I have to say, the one thing I would say, I think she's trying too hard. And she's trying to do too much and to be too perfect. Now, if this was
juggling a lot of balls, lots of eggs in lots of baskets.
Exactly. And I always believe with money, and you shouldn't try and be perfect. That's the whole 80-20 thing of, not to do with 80-20 investor, there's my DIY thing, just the principle of 80-20, is that pretty much 80% of any savings, any of the positives you do with your money will come from 20% of your efforts. So, for example, for her here, great, she's cleared her credit card, she needs to get out of the overdraft. And I would say swap to a different current account if she can, but she doesn't have to close the account. Now, it's an interesting point she raised about her credit history. It can be a good thing to have been with a bank for a few years, but you can swap and change bank accounts without having to close the previous one. So make sure if you do that, then go with a bank that doesn't stipulate you have to close the previous one. And the reason I say that, because you should try and do it, and there are some pretty decent offers out there if you switch banking, that you can get to 100, 200 quid, and she might as well do that and put that towards paying off the old overdraft, and keep her old bank account anyway for any credit checks, because that will probably help her credit record. I would argue that all the money she's paying towards her pension is not a company one, because I reckon her company one, she's probably got matched contributions. So yeah, that's free money coming from your employer and whatever. You need to take them for as big a ride as you can. Then I would move all other money just to try and clear the debt, because she's paying to save. There's an idea that the rate she's paying, if she's saying £25, you could work out what that rate is. And any debt you have, then if you save, she's going to get such a minuscule amount on any savings that she does, that she'd actually almost be paying to save, because the interest on the debt is so high. The Help to Buy ISA, I totally get it because of the kicker, and I get that. So I would say she's doing brilliantly. The one thing I would do is dial down the pension contributions, especially the ones she's doing on her own, and probably just put that towards clearing debt and focus on clearing debt. Now, the other thing to bear in mind, if she's going to go for a mortgage, one thing that anything you're committed to, even a pension contribution, can cause you a problem. Not in all cases, because every mortgage lender views their lending criteria differently, but affordability is a key metric now. So it's actually how much you have coming in to your bank account, how much you earn, and how much you have going out. And I've heard stories where somebody was initially rejected on the affordability criteria because they were paying into a pension. And in the end, the mortgage guy, who I know very well, had to go back and argue with them and said, "Are you serious? She could stop those at any time. They're her voluntary." But that's a commitment. That's what the mortgage guy said. So if I was her, I would look to get down that debt. It isn't bad having credit cards and things, because it shows that you can use them. Pay by direct debit, always, because then it makes sure you always pay them. And pay all your bills by direct debit as well. Any bills she's got now, she should change to direct debit, because it stops what happened previously happening again. And if she makes sure she's on all the electoral rolls, she's got her name on most on all the bills, then that'll be positive for her credit rating. So yeah, I would not be so trying to be so perfect with your finances and all that pension contributions, because I'll be honest, I've told you before, I have not focused on building a pension for a long time. It's best to start when you're young, and she is such a role model. But you have to be realistic. When I've got to feed my kids, keep a roof over my head, that's going to be very... having a pension is going to be very little comfort when I'm 35. So, well, I'm not 35, I'm late 30s, I'm lying. So, that's brilliant. The other thing I would quickly say on this is, be careful. If she's got a boyfriend, don't get joint finances. Don't do joint bills and all those. Keep your stuff very separate. Because if she's got a bad credit rating, then if they start having joint bank accounts and things like that, he will get associated with her, and his credit rating could get impacted if he has a good one. So keep them very separate. I know people who do that, and I know people who are, where the husband has such a bad credit rating that he wouldn't get credit for anything, and has got CCJs and all sorts, but the wife has everything in her name, and for the intents and purposes of mortgage, credit card companies, they almost wouldn't know they were married. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because it's about the financial connections, and so her credit rating is protected, and they get all credit through her.
Perhaps in that scenario, just ditch the guy. He sounds a bit of a loser.
Yeah. But I think she should pat herself on the back. Don't try to be too perfect. Do enjoy your money a bit, because that's the other thing. I keep saying this to people who get to 60 and retire. Then you've got to enjoy life a little bit, because you can save for a rainy day forever and for tomorrow, and tomorrow never ever comes. She's doing enough now, and I think the main thing is to keep doing what she's doing. She clears her debts, she'll be fine.
I think that's really a good advice. All round, actually, from what you just said. But in terms of, you've got to live with it as well. I definitely go through cycles in our family finances. I'll have 3 or 4 months where I'm Mr. Skinflint, really, really tight. We can't afford this, can't afford that. We've got to think of the future. And then every so often, we just have a blowout. We just go clothes shopping, or we might book a holiday when you're just in the moment. And I think it's healthy. It's just like when you're dieting. At the end of the day, you're going to get fed up with it, eating lettuce, and you're going to go out for that Chinese meal. So yeah, live a little. Enjoy it.
Live a little. And if she does read that restructuring and saves herself that £25 a month by moving that debt onto the 0%, then she could live a little, couldn't she, Andy? I'm the same as you, though. I've always been like that. I don't spend a lot of money, not because I'm tight. I just don't particularly gain a lot of value from owning things, which is probably quite handy given that I've got no money. So on that note, until next week then, Andy, we won't whittle on. Make sure you go and look at 80/20 Investor, because we're getting, again, lots of great feedback from the people who use it. We've just designed a new logo, which you'll probably start seeing around the place, because it's grown to such a size it needs its own identity. Not separate, but it needs an identity. 80/20 Investor.
I have to say I voted for one of the logos, because you put an email out to your trusty followers and your trusty 80/20 members and gave them a chance to vote for.
Yeah, funny enough, one of them got more than half the votes. There were 4 logos, and it wasn't the one that was my favourite. In fact, the one that was my favourite got 1 vote out of basically no one liked it apart from me. So wow. There you go. The wisdom of crowds, I suppose. So that's that. People will see that coming out. So anyway, go and look at 80/20 Investor. It's doing very well. The commentaries and everything, lots of great feedback, and actually take control of your money. Until next time, Andy. You can always contact me on Money to the Masses and Twitter.
I love the fact that 3 minutes ago you said we won't whittle on, and then you whistled on for another 3 minutes.
I know. I think it's because I haven't seen you for 2 weeks, Andy. I got excited. I can't help it. Anyway.
Until next week.
Until next week.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Plan. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.